Hi there, welcome to MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. We have a lot going on this week. It may be summer vacation, but we're taking a deep dive into education tonight, funding and management. Plus, we're going to be debating the dump Trump philosophy, and we'll give you a closer look at encouraging the growth of creative industries in Detroit. It is all coming up for you, but we are going to be starting with schools. The governor just signed off on the budget, and for education, it's $16.1 billion. And the extra funding, well, it was a good thing. If you've seen a new report this week that says the state's funding for schools is becoming increasingly unequal, and districts that spend on average of $8,600 a student are the ones that are, quote, notably successful. Now, the study was commissioned by the state to see what it would take for students to meet the state's graduation requirements. Plus, we are now getting a first look at how the State School Reform Office is handling academically struggling schools. Not everyone is really happy with the CEO model that is being put in place in the East Detroit district. So let's get to it tonight with our MiWeek contributors, the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, Nolan Finley, and the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press, Stephen Henderson. Guys, you like it? I threw in the whole title tonight so people know actually what we're dealing with here tonight. You know, there's been a lot of stuff about education in the news for the past 2 weeks or so. So I felt like it's kind of this whole scramble that we've got to kind of put together. And I think I want to start off with this study that came out that Michigan commissioned, taking a look at what it would take for our state to be on the same page. And I think, Nolan, let me start with you. When we're looking at the inequality of funding, how do we get back to a point where I guess, is money really solving it, and do you put more money for a better education?
Well, let's just start with this study. This study's, the conclusion of this study was foregone when it was commissioned. This firm that did the study finds the same answer in every state. It's always money, money, money. The governor should have never signed off on this. He let the Democrats bargain him into this study, which is now going to confuse the real conversation in Michigan.
So you say that the study's not even really legitimate?
You know, what the study does is put the cart way ahead of the horse. What are you funding with this more money? And that's the point we haven't got to in Michigan, is what it's going to take to make education better. And if the answer is simply a fatter check, we aren't going to get where the other states are, who have made fundamental changes in the way they educate their children and then added money. And we're still in the 21st century now. We're a decade and a half into it, still educating children basically the same way we did a century ago, lining them up in classrooms in front of a teacher and lecturing them and talking to them. There's got to be other methods to reach children who are programmed entirely different than they were when we were kids or our parents were kids.
Can you dispute, though, and maybe this is something that you guys are going to get into with each other, though, that when you have a certain amount of money and you've got a district that's able to pay for more books or able to pay for better facilities, able to pay for better teachers, or able to pay, that money can make a difference?
Yeah, well, I mean, flip that question on its head. Does inequality matter, right? Does it matter if you pay less for kids in desperate circumstances than you do in better circumstances? Of course it does. And you know, we've let that go for a long time in Michigan without addressing them. It's been 22 years since Proposal A, which made things better, more equal than they were before. But you know, it's starting to show its age in the sense that it's not doing that anymore. And this report points out ways that the gap is getting wider, not narrower. I mean, the truth is we have models for this. I mean, we always in Michigan sort of poo-poo what everyone else has done and don't look at, you know, success. Massachusetts is probably exhibit A of what happens when you do what Nolan was talking about, look at how you are educating kids, devise a system that's focused on their education and holds people accountable for that, and then adds money as well. They did both back in the early 1990s, and the results are not disputable. On the national test, the NAEP test, kids in Boston, black kids in poor schools in Boston, do better than the wealthy white kids in Michigan. There's still a gap in that state between how poor kids and wealthier kids do, but the wealthy kids in that state are at a level where they're competing internationally. They're not even competing with kids here in America anymore. And so there's no question that if you do that, if you concentrate on it, add the money and stick with it. That's the other thing that's key to Massachusetts. They haven't changed horses a million times.
You have to start with a plan. You have to start with a strategy.
Well, they did both at the same time.
We don't have one. We don't have a unified strategy. And it's not all about money. Highland Park had some of the highest per pupil funding in the state, and that district's going away.
Well, so but they keep trotting this out. People who don't want to add more money, they keep trotting out the Highland Park example. What that boils down to is the high number of kids they have in special ed, who in some cases get.
That wasn't the case in Highland Park.
It's a small district. If you had 3 or 4 kids who were getting $25,000 to $45,000 a year for their education, which they should under federal law, that skews the number.
Well, this report also says that there needs to be a comprehensive tracking program for special ed funding that Michigan doesn't currently have right now.
One of the bigger problems we have in terms of true inequity in funding is the legacy costs these districts have, and the amount of money that's not per pupil money that's not getting in the classroom. But even our well-funded districts in Michigan, even our affluent districts, are performing far worse than their peers across the country. We're in the bottom 10%, even in our affluent districts. We've got to figure out what we're going to do with this money before we raise it and spend it. We can't just keep thinking all we have to do is add more funds every year. When we raise the foundation grant every year, and 30, 40, 50% of that never makes it to the classroom. It goes in to solving these long-term deficits we built into the system.
All right, so then if we have a report like this come out, Stephen, and then so Nolan says, well, this was kind of skewed from the very beginning. Are we back to square one when it comes to having some kind of comprehensive plan coming out of where? The governor's office? Coming out of where? The legislature?
I mean, if this governor were more of a leader and more capable of leading the legislature to do the things he wanted to do, I'd have more faith in the idea that he could take this report and make something out of it. Of course, this is a governor who gets led by a majority in the legislature that, when it comes to education, is completely bought off and not interested in that larger discussion, not interested in either having it or coming up with what Nolan's talking about, which is a comprehensive plan, and won't fund it. So I don't know what will happen until those dynamics, those players are different.
How do you answer that?
Well, but in other states, it wasn't strictly a politically led reform. In
Tennessee, can we get away from that here?
Massachusetts, it was.
Can we get away from politically led reform?
William Weld put this stuff through the legislature and said, we're going to do it the socialist way. That's what he said. But we're going to put more money in poor districts than we do in
Tennessee, which is making huge progress. It is. The business community led this. The business community fought for this and held the politicians accountable. And so it's managed to survive. Their efforts managed to survive changes from administration, from Republican to Democrat. Nothing we do in this state today in terms of education will survive a partisan change. And because we still haven't made this a priority. I don't think we even realize how poorly our schools are doing in comparison to the rest of them.
All right, well, speaking about the schools that are doing poorly, I want to address the whole idea of coming out of the state school reform office that now is under the control of the governor and talking about dealing with academically struggling schools. For the past 6 years, they've had some kind of authority to be able to take over a school district. We haven't seen that implemented until now. So the East Detroit School District is going to be getting a CEO.
And the individual schools.
Individual schools. So talk to me about, is this now the way that we're going to be seeing struggling schools being handled? Because this is the conversation that we've heard coming out of the DPS conversation that, the states always had the ability to close poor performing schools or to deal with poor performing schools. Is this now the model that we're going to see, Stephen?
Maybe. I mean, the governor seems all in favor of this. I'm really skeptical of the effectiveness of this model. I'm not sure why just putting a CEO in charge changes outcomes again in the classroom. And again, this happens outside the context of this larger sort of refocusing on what schools should be doing and then what it costs us to do that. And so, number one, I think it's a little bit of the backdooring of the emergency manager model that has not worked for school districts, hasn't worked for any school district, in fact, in Michigan. It's another way to sort of take that same model and perpetuate it in a way that bypasses the due process even that emergency management has. I'm really puzzled by the strategy here and why anyone thinks it'll produce something different than what we have.
Will this produce something different, do you think, Nolan?
I don't know. It feels to me like a reconstituted version of the EAA, which clearly didn't work. I don't see how simply bringing in I mean, before it was let's bring in a top principal and that'll change the school. That was the EAA theory. And now it's bringing in a CEO and it'll change it. It sounds to me the same. I think we keep trying to work around the reality that some of these schools can't be fixed. Some of these schools can't be saved. We got an overcap capacity of school seats in Detroit by about 40,000, 45,000 seats. And we've got 40 schools that are on the chronically failing list, 31 public, traditional public, 9 charters. Why not close those schools instead of keep trying to fix them, reduce the operating costs, reduce the overhead for the district, and maybe we can start to focus on schools that are working instead of fixing schools that don't.
So I guess my question is, so are we going to start to see more of an aggressive approach from the state? And that is, again, not
aggressive in what way?
Aggressive in terms of starting to close down or saying, you know what, now we're going to academically hold them accountable. Because that was, again, the whole conversation about not having a Detroit Education Commission when it came to the DPS bills was that authority can come from the state reform office.
State reform. I hope so.
I would hope so. I also think that the toothless version of the DEC that we got will be able to assert itself by doing what it can do, which is identifying the markers for success and failure in schools, and really putting pressure on people, the people who are going to be in charge of schools in Detroit, to fix schools or close them. I mean, the idea of closing schools is one thing. Our other problem in Detroit is that, and this is in Michigan, anybody can open a school. I mean, Nolan and I can come up with an idea for a school, get an application and have that thing up and running if we get funding by next year.
That's the school I think I'd like to see. I'd like to see that school.
If they can get an authorizer to back them. I think given the overcapacity in Detroit, I don't think you're going to see a whole lot
people
of
are not opening schools right now.
And that's in one sense that's a shame, because there's some very good operators in the market who don't come here. I think the school reform office can play a role similar to what the DEC was supposed to look like. I would like to see them draw on the Detroit Education Coalition for an advisory board for the school reform office and bring in some community accountability. There's a lot of ways to make that work. We just got to start doing it.
All right.